So it's wonderful to be here. So the ocean covers over 70% of our planet. We basically live on a planet ocean. The ocean literally gives us life. Every second breath we take comes from the ocean. The ocean regulates our climate, provides us with food, jobs, recreation, health and well-being, and peace. But the oceans are in serious trouble. Climate change is causing our seas to warm, to acidify, and reducing the oxygen content of the seas. And this is having untold consequences on life in the ocean. Fish stocks are migrating, corals are bleaching, and climate change is causing, for example, shellfish to not be able to grow. It inhibits their growth. And then there's overfishing. Did you know that most of the world's fish stocks are currently fished or overfished, or that 90%, that's 90, of oceanic predators such as sharks and tunas and swordfish are already gone? Legal and illegal overfishing is devastating marine ecosystems around the world, often irreversibly. And then there's pollution, which is suffocating our oceans, with an estimated 8 million tons of plastic entering our oceans every year. Plastics has now entered our food chain. It is in the food we eat, in the fish we eat, it's in the water that we drink, and it is in the air that we breathe. So the urgency to act now and to act fast is real. And I've spent much of my life trying to understand and protect the oceans. I've worked on a range of issues, from advocating for sustainable seafood to fighting illegal fishing, exposing slavery and labor abuse at sea, and campaigning for protected areas. And I've had the privilege to travel around the world to communities in West Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the Pacific, Europe, and I've even spent time roaming the high seas. The high seas make up, they're in the middle of the ocean, the bulk of the ocean, they make up 64% of the ocean. And they are defined by the fact that they don't belong to any one nation, so they're beyond the national jurisdiction of any country. Sounds great, right? That means that they belong to all of us. But think about it, 64%. That translates to nearly half of our planet that is essentially unregulated. Now, I have to say, and I'm happy to say, that the United Nations, after years of campaigning by NGOs, are finally negotiating a treaty that is meant to protect life on the high seas. And hopefully that treaty will be finalized this year. But it remains to be seen just how effective that treaty will be and whether governments will indeed put conservation ahead of short-term financial gains. Let's stay with high seas for a little bit. This is where the personal story comes in. That's me diving alongside a net full of tuna, skipjack tuna to be precise, at a depth of 23 meters. It was 2012, and I was expedition leader on board the Greenpeace ship, the Esperanza, running a campaign against illegal fishing in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean. I was also the most qualified diver in the crew, and so I was designated the safety diver, which explains the pole. I was fending off sharks. So as we approached this net, and this net was from a Philippine flagged purseine vessel. The purseiner describes the type of fishing gear. But as I approached this net, I could feel and see the stress that the tuna was experiencing. Thousands of faces pressed up against the mesh of the net. And as I was processing this, to my horror, I then saw a foot protruding from the fish. And 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What do you do how do you deal with discovering a dead body on the high seas? But then, soon enough, a face emerged, and I could see that it was a man, that he was alive, and that he was, in fact, working. So he was swimming in and amongst thousands of tuna with no protective gear to speak of, no basic scuba gear. Now, if you dive, then you know that at 23 meters, if you're working, you need to have some basic scuba gear. But this man just had a hose that he clenched between his teeth, and that was coming down from the ship and supplying him with air. And I was thinking, well, how do you hold on to, to a hose at that depth with so many tuna flying around? But yeah, he did. And so you might be asking, what was he doing? So his job was to corral the fish inside the purse seine net and into a scooper net, which is then hauled up onto the deck of the boat. So when I got to the surface, I asked to inspect the conditions on board. And he allowed me to come on board. And I very quickly discovered many labor rights violations. For example, the compressor that he showed me that was supplying him with the air was really rusty, and you couldn't monitor the air quality or composition. But this vessel was not fishing illegally. Technically, it was legal. It had a license. And I've seen far worse conditions on board fishing vessels, and also far worse conditions in terms of environmental devastation. But so here, by the way, you can see him. This is later in the dive. He's on the outside of the net, and you can see him with the hose out of his mouth. So all of this prompted me to think about, what it is that we are doing that is so wrong in today's society. Why are we prepared to sacrifice animal and human life for the sake of providing cheap seafood for those that need it least? I mean, to be clear, the tuna that's caught in the Western and Central Pacific, and indeed in almost every ocean around the world, much of that ends up on our plates here in Europe. So, I wondered about, why it is that we are willing to do this. And all my work in the ocean space, both on land and in sea, has consistently led me to conclude that if we don't embrace our diversity, and it's consistently led me to conclude that if the same thing, and that is if we don't embrace our diversity and shape our society collectively, then we are never going to achieve a green, and by that I mean living in harmony with our planet, and peaceful future. Right. So. So I look at the ocean. Sorry, I'm just got a bit of a tickle. But the ocean is a perfect example of this discrepancy, where we're missing diversity. We're missing the feminine perspective in ocean policy and decision making. And thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So if I look at ocean policy in particular, we're missing the feminine perspective. And by feminine, I mean that it's a perspective that goes beyond the self, and it's about the collective. And the law of the sea, or the ocean, is a perfect example of this discrepancy, because the law of the sea, incidentally, also has its origins with a Dutchman, but really only considers power and sovereignty. And this is evident in the fact that it has neglected to consider life in 2/3 of the ocean. So I started to think about this, and I thought, well, even at every level of ocean governance and management, from the local level to the international level, what's missing in decision-making are the voices of women. And this goes beyond just including the feminine perspective, but it is about our diversity. Each one of us has a unique perspective. And the way I see the ocean, or the value of the ocean, and therefore the approach to protecting it, is different from the way you would see it. There is no one size fits all, but one thing is common between us all, and that is that we want and we need healthy oceans, whether it is to stabilize our climate, or whether it is to feed our families, or simply to enjoy. And so I address this issue by setting up a platform that connects and amplifies the voices of women in the ocean space. We must inspire women from all educational and cultural backgrounds to engage in ocean issues, whether they are scientists or lawmakers or concerned citizens, so that we too can occupy the same space in decision-making as men do. And so the Women for Oceans platform currently has over 2,500 women in it from around the world. And I advocate for women's equal participation at forums from the United Nations to the World Ocean Summit. And I set up a directory, a searchable directory, where conference organizers can find women based on their, based on their expertise. So in any given ocean field, illegal fishing, plastic pollution, ocean governance, you name it. And it also allows us to connect with each other and find each other. So, for example, if you're working in on shark protection in Bangladesh, for example, you can find your peers in other parts of the world. And this allows us to share information, allows us to help each other, and ultimately it accelerates positive outcomes for the ocean. If diversity and inclusion is something that is considered good practice in the business world, and by that I mean it increases the profitability of a company, then surely the same applies to the natural world and to our efforts to manage and protect that. So yeah, if we want to shape a better future for all of us, then it is time that we harness our full potential as a species. And I think that's also resonates very well with what both Bonnie and Jeanne have said before me. Thank you very much.